Hi, welcome to the Tenement Museum. My name is Danielle Wetmore, and I'm a lead educator here at the Tenement Museum. Welcome to Secrets from the Privy Vault. I'm really excited to be on this program along with all of you. The Tenement Museum is a museum that tells the stories of real people who really did live in two buildings, 97 Orchard Street and 103 Orchard Street. The majority of the families that lived in these two buildings on the Lower East Side of New York City were working class immigrant families. We at the Tenement Museum love to be in conversation. And so even though that this platform is now online when I can't be in the same room with all of you, conversation is still possible. There's a chat on YouTube. And if you have any questions on your chat, stick it in there and Jason will be sure that those questions get to me. Additionally, we are testing an automated live captioning program that you can access by clicking a link that will be in the chat. So let's get started. So on this program, we're looking to uncover the secrets from the Privy Vault and consider the role that the rear yard of 97 Orchard Street played in the lives of the families that lived in the building. Let's take a look at that space. So right now we're looking at the rear yard of 97 Orchard Street. So this is just behind the building. This picture was taken right after the recreation of the rear yard happened in 2009. And we don't know for sure that it looked exactly like this. This is the Tenement Museum's interpretation of what the rear yard could have looked like. And over the course of this program, we'll be talking about how we know what we know about the space, along with how the rear yard was used by people over time and thought about over time as well. So in this image, what we're looking at is an outdoor space. The ground is covered in a blue flagstone, and there's a lot of wood. There's a big wooden structure to the right of the image that has 4 doors with half moon shapes along the top. That's the privy structure. So that's an outdoor toilet structure. To us, it might look kind of like an outhouse or even a porta potty. We call it privies. And so in this image, there are 4 of them. And privies are an outdoor toilet structure that sit atop an underground pit to hold human waste. Just in front of the privies, we see a water spigot that residents could get water from for cooking, for cleaning, for drinking, for washing. And this space was really important in the lives of all of the residents, the people who lived inside of 97 Orchard Street. But how do we know that it looked like this? Well, to start this story, we should go, as Julie Andrews says, back to the very beginning. And for the Tenement Museum, that's 1988. In 1988, Ruth Abram and Anita Jacobson founded the Tenement Museum in this building, 97 Orchard Street. And this is what it looked like in the 1980s. So on the right, that black and white picture is 97 Orchard Street. It was built in 1863 by a man named Lucas Glockner, who was a German immigrant who had been a tailor before he built this building. But it's 5 floors. The uppermost floors we can see in this image, the windows are boarded up. People don't live in the building anymore. People hadn't lived in the building since 1935. So it's quite some time by 1988. And this is a 1980s tax photo of 97 Orchard Street. The building, though, while people weren't living in it, was still being used. The ground floor commercial spaces we can see here were still shops. So the very ground floor, the basement level, had been a commercial space from the very beginning, and the commercial space in the building grew over time. So the building was still in use for that. So that's what the front of the building looked like. And just behind the building, directly to the back of it, was the rear yard. And so the picture on the left here shows a picture from the early 1990s of that rear yard space. Notice no privies, no dark toilets, no water spigot. In fact, there's a lot of dirt, maybe some garbage, and trees. Trees are growing out of the back space back there. So while when we look at this image of the rear yard, it's not immediately apparent to us the historic use of it, we do have some clues as to what was once there. There were city records that you can see on your screen here, 2 city records, and also memories of residents. Pictured on the bottom of the screen here, the man with the hat, his name is Irving Cohen. He lived in the building in the 1930s with his mom, siblings, and grandmother. They actually moved back in to the home that his mom grew up in with his grandmother after his father passed away. And of course, there was what lied beneath the dirt. So in this next image, we can see Joan Geismar, Dr. Joan Geismar, and her team excavating the rear yard. Now, Dr. Joan Geismar, she's the one pictured directly in the middle, and she and her team have shovels. They're hand excavating the rear yard around those trees. And the Tenement Museum hired Dr. Geismar as an archaeologist to help us figure out what was back there, what can we learn about the people who lived in the building and their experiences. And so, Dr. Geismar, this was not the first rear yard of a tenement building that she was excavating. So she had a pretty good idea of what she thought she'd find. She thought she would find evidence of a standard privy vault. Now, a standard privy vault has that privy structure on the top, and then beneath the ground, that privy vault area, that pit in the ground, would just be a stone-lined pit that would hold human waste. And that waste would have to be emptied. That was often done by people whose job it was to dig out the human waste. They were called night soil men, and they would come with buckets and shovels, dig out the human waste, and dispose of it either in the East River or often along the streets. This is a drawing from Ludlow Street near Houston that shows the waste that would gather along the streets in this period in the 1860s into the 1890s. And on the bottom left-hand side of this image here, we can see a woman who is disposing of something. She's throwing something away into the street, and that's where it's staying. No one would come and collect it. And so any household garbage you had, toss it in the street, and that would mix with human waste that the night soil men were dumping back there, along with, we can see a horse along the street, right? And so there are accounts of there being upwards of 3 feet of waste in some spaces. So we know what Dr. Joan Geismar expected, but it turns out that's not what she found. She and her team, while they were excavating, didn't just find evidence of a standard just stone pit in the ground. They found a brick-lined vault, so a brick sort of cube we can think of, connected to the sewer system. Now, this is pretty exciting because that means that the waste, the human waste that ends up in that privy vault, can be washed away into the sewer into the East River. So you win some, you lose some. But it means that the waste isn't staying in the rear yard. It's being taken away. And also it's only going in one direction. No one has to come and dig it out. And it helps keep the rear yard cleaner. The fact that Lucas Glockner connects the privies to the sewer, and that water spigot that was in that rear yard connected to the Croat Aqueduct, bringing clean, fresh water from upstate down here. So it's good water. It's clean water. These are costs that are added to a building that Lucas Glockner is building, the man who built the building. And we don't know exactly why he makes the choices he does. Maybe they are based on social expectations. Maybe they are based on legal expectations. Maybe they are based on health concerns. The best thing that we can do to sort of get an idea of what Lucas Glockner's frame of mind was as he was making the choices he did is to go back into thinking about his life and his experiences and what he may have seen and experienced up until the time that he built 97 Orchard Street. So Lucas Glockner came from Germany at the age of 22 in 1842. He'd spent his life as a tailor, or his professional life as a tailor, before building 97 Orchard Street. Shortly after coming in 1842, he meets a woman named Katharina. They have 3 children together. And while he's raising a young family, New York City experiences a cholera outbreak. It was an epidemic, which means that a lot of people were getting sick and it was spreading very quickly. And right now we're living in a pandemic, right? And so that means it's a global, or many countries are having epidemics. An epidemic is more specific to a region. So New York City was experiencing a cholera epidemic in that time period. And so many people are getting cholera, it's being spread, and it's causing a huge problem. And people are really concerned with their health and safety. Cholera is spread fecally orally. So rear yards like the ones that we were just talking about are a big reason why cholera was being spread so much. You have an outdoor toilet with a pit of waste underneath it that's being dug out right next to a water source, your water spigot, for cooking soup, for washing your hands, for washing your laundry. All of that's happening in that space, and that is causing illness to spread quite quickly. Now, at the same time that Lucas Glockner is raising a young family, there's a man named John Snow. Not that John Snow. That John Snow. So this John Snow, he was observing Londoners in 1854. He wasn't on Game of Thrones. Observing Londoners, 1854, and he was noticing that there were neighborhoods that he thought were fairly similar to one another, but that these people living in those neighborhoods were experiencing cholera at very different rates. And so he was trying to follow those people around and figure out what is different about their lives that might be causing this disparity, this difference in the rates of cholera there. And one of the things he did is he watched where they were getting their water from. Now, both of these neighborhoods were getting their water by going to the Thames River in London and bucketing the water out. One neighborhood was getting their water further upriver than the other one. What he noticed was that in between these two spots where these neighborhoods were getting their water along the Thames River was a waste disposal spot. So it was a place where people were dumping human waste, other waste disposal going into that spot. Those who were getting their water upstream from that spot were not getting cholera at the same rates as those who were getting their water further downstream from that spot. So while he wasn't able to say exactly why or how, while he wasn't able to say exactly how cholera was spreading, he was able to say that it had something to do with clean water, that having access to clean water was very important for this. So Lucas Glockner has a bunch of things to consider. He probably was not keenly aware of the work that John Snow was doing in London. But there are officials in New York City who might have been a little bit more aware of it. In 1863, when Lucas Glockner builds 97 Orchard Street, he and actually two friends had bought one plot of land and were planning to build 3 buildings along that plot of land. And so that means 3 new buildings were expected to be built along Orchard Street between Broome and Delancey Street. Well, it just so happens in 1963, there's a sewer laid on Orchard Street between Broome and Delancey Street. It is quite possible that this sewer is laid there because of this new real estate that is happening on the block. It was quite common for the sewer lines to be laid where there was real estate speculation. Because that sewer line was laid there, the property owners along the street all had to pay a fee. So they had to pay a fee because the sewer was there, whether or not they intended to connect to the sewer itself. So the fact that Lucas Glockner had to pay that fee already might have inspired him just to keep going, spend a little bit of extra money, build out a privy and a vault that connects to that sewer. Maybe he thought having a clean rear yard was really important for the health of himself and his family because they were going to move into the building. Him and his family live in the building in the first couple years of the building being occupied. Maybe he puts in the Croton water and the Privy system because he knows about how that will affect his property value, that he'll be able to resell the property later on and make pretty good profit, which he does. Maybe it's a combination of all of these things. But what we do know is that having that privy that flushes into the sewer and that Croton aqueduct water really aids in helping stop the spread of cholera in 97 Orchard Street. Okay, so we've gotten some idea about Lucas Glockner, the man who built the building, maybe why he did what he did, but ultimately he built this building so that people can live inside. We should think more about that. On the image here, on the left is a picture of the front of 97 Orchard Street, the Tenement Museum, what it looks like right now if you were to visit today. Probably don't, but that's what it would look like. And so 5 floors plus the commercial space downstairs. The earliest commercial space in 97 Orchard Street was a German lager beer saloon. Now we can imagine that a resident, let's say Natalie Gumpertz, who was a Prussian immigrant with a 2-year-old daughter living in the building. And she and her daughter Rosa were in the neighborhood just grabbing a couple things for dinner tonight. Not a big grocery haul, just a few things for tonight. And they come up to the building, they walk up those front steps, those black steps in the front, and they go up to that front door. They open the front door, it opens into a hallway. That hallway is pictured on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, this hallway is a picture of what it looks like now at the Tenement Museum. It wouldn't have looked like this in 1869, the year we're imagining right now. There wouldn't have been any light inside. It would have been very dark in that hallway, and the tiling on the floor wouldn't have been there. It would have been a solid pine floor. The feeling that would have been similar, though, or exactly the same, is how narrow the hallway is. That hasn't changed. And so Rosa and Natalie make their way through that front door, down the hall towards the steps. And Natalie decides, I'm not going to go up the steps. I'm going to keep going down the hall. I got to go to the rear yard. I need a bucket of water. I'm going to need it for something at some point tonight. So might as well get it while I'm already down here. So she and Rosa make their way into the rear yard, down the steps, and into the space that we were looking at before. Lo and behold, they run into Caroline Schneider down here. Caroline Schneider and her husband, John Schneider, run a lager beer saloon on the ground floor of the building. They are German immigrants. And so maybe Natalie's excited to run into her friend, and they start chatting to one another about their days or about what Natalie got when she was grocery shopping. Maybe she got a great deal on green beans. Maybe they're talking about other people in the neighborhood or gossiping about the building. This conversation was happening mostly in German. This neighborhood was known as Klein Deutschland, Little Germany. If this neighborhood had been its own city, it would have been the 5th largest German-speaking city on the planet. These two women are chatting. Caroline's doing laundry in this space, which was quite common. If you look at the top of this image here, you can see laundry being hung. You see the tips of the cloth hanging down. And they're chatting. Rosa is maybe twirling in the corner, enjoying this outside time when her mom isn't just staring at her. This rear yard plays sort of an important role in being an outdoor space for the kids in the building because there weren't any parks in the neighborhood yet. So this is really an access to an outdoor space that they have. And so while they're chatting, the moms are chatting, Rosa's twirling, right? Maybe 2 other girls come running down the stairs. They are Mary Kate, who's 4, and Jane, who's 3. Running down the stairs in front of their mom, Bridget. Bridget is an Irish woman who moved to New York City at the age of 17, and the Moore family is the newest family in the building in 1869. And so the girls go running down the stairs. They're 4 and 3 years old. That's super fun. Maybe mom for a second, Bridget for a second, steals herself at the top of the stairs because she hears women speaking in German downstairs and thinks, is this going to be really awkward for me again? She goes down there because she has to, because it's the only source of running water for the building. And she goes down there, and maybe Caroline right away shoots her a big smile and switches to English and welcomes her into the conversation. And maybe the 3 girls start playing with one another. Maybe Natalie and Caroline pause for a second, give a smile and a wave, but they carry on with their conversation in German as they were before. Maybe they ignore her altogether. Maybe the girls play. Maybe they don't. I don't know. I don't know exactly what the social feelings and life was of the people who were inhabiting this space. What I do know is that these 3 women lived in this building and they would have run into each other at some point, and they had a relationship of some kind. I don't know what it was though, but I think it's important to think about it just to animate this space, to give a sense of the social quality that was happening there. And while these women are sort of in this space and living in the building and moving out of the building, this space continues to exist. In 1870, there were 72 residents that lived in 97 Orchard Street. By 1900, there were 105. There were still 4 outdoor toilets and still 1 outdoor water spigot. And over that entire period of time, tuberculosis became a problem for people living in the building. It was spreading very quickly. In fact, tuberculosis was endemic to the neighborhood. So that means that tuberculosis sort of just existed in the neighborhood and people weren't able to eradicate it. People were constantly catching and spreading it. And that rear yard might have been one of the places that tuberculosis was spreading so quickly. Tuberculosis is spread by respiratory droplet transmission, something we've been thinking a lot about lately, right? And so that rear yard space, thinking about standing in line for privies, standing in line for the water, doing laundry back there, somebody coughs, somebody yells, somebody sings. All of that would impact how tuberculosis was spreading. Oh, I just saw a question came through. This question is from Pedro. Hi, Pedro. Would they have that much sunlight? Would that affect socializing? No, they wouldn't have had that much sunlight. That's a really good point. That picture is such a lovely picture that really highlights everything in that rear yard, but it also makes it look really bright. And that is misleading because our rear yard right now, it goes out onto Allen Street. It goes onto a street, which was very important for Ruth and Anita when they founded the Tenement Museum, because they needed a building for a museum that had an exit to the back. It had 2 means of entry and egress. That's important for fire safety. And so that was great for them in that case. But what it means for us is that that rear yard doesn't feel exactly as it would have felt, because Allen Street is there now instead of the tenement buildings that had been there. Those tenement buildings had Allen Street addresses with rear yards that backed up right against ours. But what that means is that you have this big structure that's going to block a lot of that sunlight. So you might get a little bit of sunlight during the day, but you're not going to get a lot. It, for the most part, is going to be a rather shady space. Thank you so much for that question. Keep the questions coming. As something comes to mind, I'm happy to field that question. I love talking to people. Thinking about that sort of cold, damp space, right, of that rear yard, and feeling how tuberculosis is spreading there, something that's also important to consider in the cases of both cholera and tuberculosis was the stigma that was being attached to people who were sick, that they were seen as spreaders of disease, even though it wasn't exactly clear about how diseases were spreading, and germ theory wasn't something that people had a very clear understanding of. The idea that microbes are what's spreading illness. There was an idea that people who were not as good or not as American or who were foreign were ones spreading diseases at rates much, much different than those who were native-born middle-class Americans. What we know now about tuberculosis is that when we look at the rates, a middle-class American person can infect just as many people as a working class immigrant. But those middle class American people often had access to more private bathrooms. And that might make a really big difference. But that's not what people were talking about. People weren't talking about different access to amenities. People were talking about people who were bad people spreading bad illnesses that were dangerous to everybody. Caroline Schneider and John Schneider both get tuberculosis, and both of them die of tuberculosis. On the screen now, we can see a picture of John Schneider's death certificate. We know it's his because if we look at the top of the page, it says Certificate of Death in the City of New York. Just underneath that to the right, it says John Schneider. We know that the cause of death is general tuberculosis because if we look at the top of the bottom third of the page, It says chief and determining, and then it says general tuberculosis. Now, it wasn't surprising, likely to the people in their time period or to us, that both John and Caroline died of tuberculosis. It was very, very common in the neighborhood and highly contagious. And in this time period, well, the mechanisms to treat it didn't really exist. When somebody got tuberculosis, they knew that they were going to die of tuberculosis. But there are all these concerns mounting about immigrant neighborhoods, working class neighborhoods, and diseases and hygiene and health and cleanliness. Some of this is coming from residents themselves, concerned about their communities, looking around and seeing how many people are sick and wanting to know if there's something that they could do about it. Some of it was coming from nurses and midwives who are living in the neighborhood and working in the neighborhood to treat people for their illnesses. Midwives and nurses were mostly women from the middle class who came to these neighborhoods to act as midwives, as nurses. And they were noticing that there were so many sick people and people were getting sick at such a high rate. And they wanted to do something to pause that. They wanted to do something to make that better. And they were also concerned about themselves spending time with so many sick people or in these sick spaces. And then there are progressive reformers. Progressive reformers were mostly men from the middle class who looked at these tenement buildings with large immigrant populations and saw them as breeding grounds of immorality. And they also believed, well, we'll get to that in just a second. Right now, I want to look at this image that's on the screen. So by the early 1900s, many buildings had privies in their backyard that were still there that maybe weren't kept up as well as they could have been, or maybe those structures were hard to keep up, or maybe they were just getting old and outdated. But this image here that you see on the screen is not of 97 Orchard Street, of our rear yard, but it is of another tenement building. We can see this rear yard had a lot of privies. I count 7 doors there. And we can see the slats in the top of the doors. They're starting to break. Maybe there's not a lot of privacy. All the way to the right, the door is open and we get a peek inside. If we looked at the ones inside the rear yard of 97 Orchard Street, once you open the door, the privy would just look just like that. It was very, very common. We see some trash in there. And progressive reformers are looking at images like this and they're saying, see, this is a problem. Look at these people. And we see people in this image, right? We see a man standing with his back up against the wall, 2 women around the water faucet collecting water. And progressive reformers, like Jacob Riis, he was a famous progressive reformer who was pioneering flash photography and wrote a book called How the Other Half Lived. And he and other people are pushing for changes. They're saying, look at this rear yard. This is an example of why we need to do something. This is bad. There's other pictures of other rear yards. In fact, we have one more to show you here. Here is one that, something that's exciting for us in this picture is that this stair setup shows us a basic idea about what the stairs of our rear yard would have looked like at 97 Orchard, we believe. Here we see 3 people, I think maybe a woman and 2 girls. The woman looks like she's getting water from the faucet. We see a bunch of big buckets to do laundry in. And it doesn't look like here that there are paving stones on the ground. It looks quite muddy. And so progressive reformers, another thing they're concerned about is they believe that there's this relationship that goes back and forth from your physical surroundings informing your moral character and your moral character informing your physical surroundings. And so they thought the best way that they could impact this relationship was to change the physical surroundings, that would help change the nature of the people in these neighborhoods. Oh, it looks like we got another question popped up. Why was tuberculosis getting so bad? That's a really good question. And in some ways, epidemiologists, so those are people who study diseases and how they're spread, are still thinking about that. One is the way that it's transmitted, again, that's respiratory droplets. And so sometimes we think of that as sneezing and coughing, which is true. That's a way of spreading. And so that's why we talk about, sneezing like this into your elbow. That's going to help. It's why we talk about wearing masks right now, because of a concern of respiratory droplets. But it also is something that happens when you yell. If you're yelling really loud or you get really excited and scream, respiratory droplets are happening. If you're singing, respiratory droplets are happening. If you're in a saloon at the bottom of the Tenement Museum building in the Schneider's Lager Beer Saloon and people are smoking cigars, it's going to be dusty. There are musicians playing brass instruments, right? All of this is happening in that space. And that means there's lots of respiratory droplets, lots of people. You breathe that in and you get tuberculosis. Maybe not right away because of the way the disease physically works in your body, but eventually. And so when you have lots of people in sort of more compact areas, that's going to lead to the disease spreading more quickly. People with more space around each other, they're not going to get the disease as quickly. And because of what we know about tuberculosis or other respiratory illnesses like that, is why right now experts are saying, maybe if we stay 6 feet apart from each other, maybe that'll help. Residents of 97 Orchard Street were not 6 feet apart from one another. They often didn't have the actual space to even be able to do that. Another question. Were there any laws or rules that stated there had to be this many privies per resident or apartments, like a ratio? Not yet. But we are getting to where that question will become a central part of what we're talking about. But when Lucas Faulkner builds a building in 1863, nope, no regulations about that. Okay, so we were talking about people who were concerned about life in tenement buildings and thinking about how the rear yard might impact that debate. So now we have progressive reformers, midwives, nurses, some residents, all pushing for change. Change comes in the form of a law. That law is the 1901 Tenement House Act. The 1901 Tenement House Act is a really big law. And it requires lots of different things. It says you have to have indoor plumbing. So it says you have to have one toilet for every 2 families to share inside. And so that gets at the question that was just asked, right? So the 1901 Tenement House Act is when 97 Orchard is most specifically regulated by this. So 1901, one toilet for every 2 families, 1 sink per floor. It also says things like in the hallway inside, so there had to be gas lighting in the building, and in the hallway, it had to be light enough 24 hours a day to be able to read off of a page. So a good way of testing that. It also said you couldn't have chickens inside and a bunch of other stuff. But for us on this program, we're really looking at those plumbing regulations. 1 toilet for every 2 families, 1 sink per floor. Okay, so this law is passed in 1901. But landlords pretty quickly are worried about this law because, well, they can't afford to put these amenities in the buildings, all of them. And the city or the state isn't helping with those costs. And so landlords are saying we're going to have to pass this cost onto the tenants. Some tenants are really excited about this law. They're like, you know what? Indoor plumbing, gas, running water, really, we need these in these buildings, and this is too late. There are buildings not far from here that already have electricity. Progressives see this law as a big win. They're like, yeah, we are looking for these changes. Here's a way of doing it, and it's legal. Great idea. There were also tenants, though, that said, if my rent goes up, I can't afford my rent. I can't afford to live here anymore. I'd have to move out, and I don't have anywhere else to go. And so we see that this is complicated, that people are pushing for changes that they want and feel like they need at the same time where people are saying, but what I have is good enough, and a change to that would make my life worse. Ooh, great question. Were there protests regarding the need for a better living situation in tenements? In a word, yeah. There were people who were pushing back saying we deserve better. One way of thinking about this was the way that local newspapers were being used, where people were writing into the newspaper saying what they needed and what they were looking for. And one of the things that the Tenement House Act was also trying to do was to give a way for tenants to be able to advocate for themselves and their living situations in a more clearly defined way. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a second. I want to tell you a little bit more about the law before I get to that, because I think it'll be a little fuzzy if I do it right now. But I'm going to hold on to that in my mind. Thank you for the question. But yeah, people were pushing back about all kinds of different things. So we have this complicated structure where progressives are like, yeah. Landlords are like, that sounds expensive. Can you help me out? Tenants are like, yeah, or no. So it's complicated and there isn't one answer. And I think that can be felt with the fact that this law makes its way to the Supreme Court of New York State. And in 1905, New York State upholds the law. In 1906, the National Supreme Court of the entire land, they uphold the law too. So we can see it continues. But in 1905 is really a big year for us. Because in 1905 is when we get gas and running water. So what happens in 1905, after the Supreme Court of New York State upholds the law, tenement inspectors are sent building to building to enforce the law. But this tenement inspectors group is now designed to be a place where you can write in and say, my landlord isn't following the law. Here's what's the problem. And they'll come in and inspect and try to find a way to reason with both parties as to how best to apply the law here. Ooh, I was just pausing because I saw another question. This one from Stacy. What about the garbage in the bathroom? Where did people put diapers, hygiene products? That's such a good question, Stacy. Okay, so those privy structures, those wooden structures, we saw that door open. There wasn't anything in there. There isn't any toilet paper. And so people would have to bring their own paper. And you couldn't really buy toilet paper like you can today. So people were bringing newspapers into the privies with them to use back there. Diapers, hygiene products. Well, diapers were reusable. So they're the cloth kind that you wash. But you would clean them out. You'd wash them. First, you'd scrub them on a washboard, try to knock as much dirt off of them as possible, and then boil them in a big pot inside to try to make them more hygienic. That would be true with menstrual products as well. They'd be reusable in this time period too, often rags. And then if you had any other thing that you just wanted to throw away, you had some waste, dump that in the street. You throw it out there and that's where it stays. Thank you, Stacy, for that question. Oh, right. New York State just upheld the law, and now 97 Orchard Street is trying to figure out, how do we deal with this? So in 1905 is when we get gas and running water in the building. So the law says one toilet for every 2 families to share, right? 4 apartments per floor. So that means in 97 Orchard Street, there are 2 toilets per floor. They're added into the hallway. So they're still shared by the tenants. You don't get a private toilet, but there are more, and they're inside with a regular flush toilet, very similar to what you probably have in your home right now. And the law says 1 water faucet for every floor. Landlords in 1905 go a little bit above and beyond on that one and put 1 in every kitchen. So every family gets their own sink. And so these are pretty massive changes that happen to the building and really impact those who live inside. The law also says that once these changes have been made, that outdoor privy structure needs to go away, needs to be destroyed and filled. Now, here's where our accounts get a little fuzzy. We have some conflicting accounts as to what happened here. And so remember Irving Cohen? We looked at him before. Let's look at him again. Here he is pictured at the bottom. Well, let's just play for you his memory and then we'll talk about it.
There was, what kind of toilet you call it again? I forget what, like they had in the yard.
Toilets were in the street?
In the backyard.
Oh.
Yeah, you used to throw lime in, to make it sanitary. And the bones would come in, they wanted to use it, and she would yell at them, "Get out of here, you bums!" And in her accent, she wasn't afraid. Oh no, you think she'd be afraid of me? Not her.
Afraid.
Not her. She was a tough old biddy.
I love that memory. So the tough old biddy that Irving is talking about is his grandmother. And so the reason sort of this memory is important to us is that when Irving is living in the building as a young child, it's the 1930s. We are way past 1905. And if he has this memory of his grandmother going back there and shooing what he calls bummers, but likely people who are experiencing homelessness, out of that space and throwing lime in there to clean it, that means that previous structure is still there. It wasn't removed in 1905. We also have a picture of his grandmother, Fanny, with his uncle, Sam, standing in front of what might be a privy structure in the rear yard of 97 Orchard Street. So this is Fanny Rogorshevsky and her son, Sam, Irving's grandmother and uncle. And by the time the Rogorshevskys live in the building, again, it's past 1905. These privy structures shouldn't be there anymore. But it also might beg the question, why is Fanny Rogorshevsky the one to go back there and kick people out of the rear yard? Her husband died in 1918 of tuberculosis. And after he died, she needed a way to make rent. And so the landlord made a deal with her that she would become the janitress of the building, or to keep the building up, to clean the shared spaces, and that backyard area would have been included in that. And so we have these conflicts. Exactly when these privies were removed, we don't know, at least not yet. By the time Ruth and Anita realized that 97 Orchard was the place for them to make the tenement museum, they weren't there anymore, right? It was dirt and trees, remember? So somewhere in that time, those privies were removed. We just don't know exactly when. But thinking about Joan Geismar, Dr. Joan Geismar, and her digs in 1991 and 1993 in that rear yard of the tenement building, we talked about the privies and what she found about that, but also in this privy vault, right? This program is called Secrets of the Privy Vault. We've learned one secret so far. It was connected to the sewer. Other secret, this beer stein. So when Dr. Geismar and her team found this beer stein, at first the Tenement Museum thought this might be a more recent artifact, but we got in touch with an expert who looked at it and said, this dates to the 1960s and 1960s. No, this dates to the 1860s and 1870s. And so this is quite likely a beer stein from John and Caroline Schneider's Lager Beer Saloon. Very exciting. We also found a chamber pot. So chamber pots were used by families. While there were outdoor privy structures to use to relieve yourself, sometimes it was cold, sometimes it was the middle of the night, sometimes there was a really long line, and you either couldn't or didn't want to go back there. And so many families had these chamber pots in their homes to use to relieve themselves, and then they could dispose of it in the privy at a later point. And so this isn't a full chamber pot, but it shows us evidence of them in the building. Another thing we found in the rear yard comes from a later period. So both of the beer stein and the chamber pot, we think about sort of the period of time when people lived in the building, 1863 till 1935. The image that you see on your screen here now is a crack file. That comes from the late 1980s and early 1990s, and represents a period of time on the Lower East Side that came to be known as the crack epidemic. Something that is important for us to keep in mind is that many of the more public accounts of what came to be known as the crack epidemic come from white middle-class perspectives filtered through news organizations and law enforcement. The Tenement Museum had a conversation with a police officer who was still around on the Lower East Side in the early 2000s when we talked to them, but also had been there in the 1980s and 1990s, and was the one who identified this for us as definitively a crack file. Looking at the dimensions of it when it's laying on its side, we can see it's about 2 centimeters long. Looking at the cap, it's blue and there's a rose on it. And the police officer who we spoke to said that the color might be representative of other meanings, like how much it was. Maybe blue is a different amount of money than red or green. It might also be representative of the dealer or the part of the neighborhood where this was purchased. Ultimately, we don't know. Also, these vials weren't used for super long. This is a representative of a very specific moment, because quickly foil and plastic sachets become much more common because they're cheaper. And something for us to keep in mind is, just like tuberculosis and cholera and other public health epidemics, there's a stigma that comes up around this conversation as well, and around the people who are seen as drug users or victims of the crack epidemic. And eventually it makes its way to the Lower East Side, this drug, by the late 1980s and early 1990s. But reports that were done later on say that, in fact, in New York, crack was first being used by more affluent white populations. But because it was quite cheap, it then makes its way into more working class and poor neighborhoods as well. I am not somebody who lived on the Lower East Side in this time period or experienced this, but Bob Humber is somebody who did. Pictured here in the middle is Bob Humber in the 1970s. Bob Humber has been an extraordinary activist on the Lower East Side for decades. His work has always centered children, and he has been, or was, or continues to be, instrumental in the founding of Mafinda Kalunga Garden and also Sarah D. Roosevelt Park. And here's a picture of him that's more recent. So the first one was the 1970s, and this one is much more recent because his work continues into today. And really, I want to give him the mic on this. I want him to tell us his experiences in this time period.
I could do pretty much what I thought was needed, and I bought flashlights. They said, why flashlights? I said, I bought flashlights because a lot of these kids were living in abandoned buildings and they needed flashlights to get up and down stairs. So, make a long story short, it became a game. I've been sitting down on the other end down there. This is when crack first came out, and a guy would light up, and I'd take the flashlight and I would beam on him with the flashlight. Not everybody thought that I really planned all this. I spoke at the police academy as a group from Chicago had heard about this, and they was fascinated by it. What had happened, all the kids, when I would take my flashlight out, the next night, kids had flashlights from all over.
Wow.
So if you lit up, boom, 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 and nobody wants to be in the spotlight. Right?
Yeah, sure.
So it scared the hell out of them. Yes, there's always a different issue come up. For instance, when it used to be heroin was king of Sarah D. Roosevelt Park, then it came to be crack, and they keep pushing these drugs out here, and the poor, innocent people are just falling into these traps.
I really appreciate us being able to listen to Bob Humber and his view on what was going on in the neighborhood and how he was organizing responses to it. Just like for all of the public health epidemics we've been talking about over the course of this program, there's a response that comes from the outside of the neighborhood, more of an institutional response that tends to focus on policing and punishment. And then there's also a response that comes from within the community that's looking for a care-based approach to what they see as issues in the neighborhood. While the landscape of crack is no longer visible when you walk along the Lower East Side, the effects of gentrification have really changed what the Lower East Side looks like from the 1970s into the present day. But we must continue to consider the stigmatized view of people who use drugs in the present day, as well as the stigmatized view that has happened in the past and into today about those who are sick or are seen as potentially being people who get sick. The rear yard of the Tenement Museum holds a lot of stories of hard work, of gossip, of trying to help one another, of fighting to be heard, of judgment, of working to call to care for one another. We've looked at a privy structure and the debates about whether or not that was important or how that impacted health. We've looked at a water system that brought clean, fresh water. We looked at a beer stein that might have signified the rounds of beer that maybe women were bringing into the rear yard because that was a space they were allowed to drink in a more private social way because they weren't allowed in the saloon. And we looked at a chamber pot, which might have helped make people's lives more comfortable, and a crack file that maybe somebody threw over the fence walking just down the street. We didn't think about it twice. But I'd like to now take a moment to welcome any more questions that came up for you over the course of this program. Oh, here's another one. Was New York City early or late in requiring privies, toilets, sinks, and the like? It's a very good question. I'm actually not sure about privy requirements. It'd be like outdoor toilet requirements exactly. I do know that it's something that's going to be quite necessary to have spaces. I do know that not every building had private ones when, in the 1850s and 1860s. But I don't know about sort of requirements in that. But if we think about toilets and sinks inside, it's a good question. I don't know a lot about the laws in other places. I'm really somebody who's very knowledgeable about the laws happening in New York City. A comparative question is a very good one. I do know that when working class New Yorkers are getting, toilets and water inside, it's really quite late. There are middle class and upper class New Yorkers who have had indoor plumbing since the 1860s. New York City is electrified in 1890. And so thinking about access and sort of inventions and availability of amenities versus the legality of it, I'd say the legality is maybe a little bit on the later end for some people in thinking about their perspective. It's a good question though, and there are definitely resources to look up more information like that, and I encourage you to take a look. Another question, this one from Mary. Did most tenements have running water from a central faucet, or was that considered unique? So I don't know that I understand this question 100%. I think what we're getting at is that in the rear yard, there was the one shared faucet. That was pretty common. Having access to Croton water wasn't something that was super common, but having one shared place for getting water, whether that was sort of a well back there or a faucet that led into another water system versus Croton, having one access was really very common. But even in the 5 Points, so a neighboring neighborhood to Klein Deutschland in the period, some buildings didn't even have their own water. They were sometimes sharing it with an entire block and getting it that way too. All right, so we'll take another minute or so to see if there's any other questions that come through. Oh, here's another one. How was tuberculosis eradicated more or less in NYC? I understand that it was prevalent in Chinatown in the 1970s. I can't speak to the 1970s in Chinatown. My understanding of tuberculosis is that we can't yet say that it's eradicated. In fact, I have a good friend who works in a tuberculosis lab at a hospital, but that there are treatments now that when you get tuberculosis, you're not definitely going to die of tuberculosis. And one of the things that we do a lot with tuberculosis is testing, particularly with people who work with a lot of other people. I used to be a teacher, And I had to get a tuberculosis test done every year. And so that's when they prick your arm, and then that arm prick will show whether you've been exposed to tuberculosis or not. And so having measures like that and really tracking who is sick has made a huge impact on tuberculosis. I want to really thank everybody who came to this program today. I really enjoyed having you and chatting with you through the chat. And I want to shout out Jason once again. Thank you for sending me all of those questions. And I really hope you come back for more programming and have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.